Good morning, everybody, and I want to start by thanking Dr. Middleton and Dr. Achenbari for inviting me to come and talk to you about communism and the Cold War. And maybe I should start by telling you a little bit more about my background so that you understand why it is I can speak with some authority on this topic. You're probably first wondering why I look the way I do. I have no doubt many of you are, so let me get this out of the way right away. I am an Orthodox Jew. I used to wear my kippah, my yarmulke, and after encountering incident after incident of anti-Semitism, I decided to change my look by simply changing my hat. Now I just look like an aging hippie. Don't get me wrong, if the shoe fits, wear it. I'm that as well. Let me also tell you that I am the son of Holocaust survivors. I want you to know this from the outset. I lost my entire family and extended family in concentration camps. Ladies and gentlemen, this was not something I read about. This was something that happened to me and my family. I lost my aunts and my uncles and my cousins and my grandparents and my great-grandparents for one reason: because they were Jewish, not because they were bad people. All of them. That you can't live through and not have it define your character and your values. And let me say that as a result of that experience, I have been very active in social justice causes, and I can tell you that in over 30 plus years, I've received many awards for my advocacy on behalf of social justice. When my mother, when we came after the war to the United States, it was African Americans that taught my mother and father how to speak English. In Cleveland, in a black community, a Jewish family, fresh from the war, and it was African Americans that taught my parents how to speak English. I decided at one point, after I got my doctoral degree, that I wanted to go to a historically black college and give back to the black community for what they gave to me and my family. And let me tell you something. I was there for 10 years, and I became a dean at a historically black college. I have been the chairman of the board of the Urban League, the oldest civil rights organization in the United States, older than the NAACP. I was the first person, white person, elected to the governing board of the North American Association of American Indians, representing the Great Lakes Indian tribes, the Great Lakes Indian tribes. So we're not talking about the Apache, we're not talking about the Sioux, we're not talking about the Shoshone, we're talking about the Great Lakes tribes, the Chippewa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi Indians. I went to 11 years of college. 11 years of college. I got my bachelor's at Ohio University, my master's at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the area of social policy. I made it my focus for my study and my research to become an expert on what governments and societies should do to respond to the social conditions and the needs of people. Not economic policy, not foreign policy, but think of it as what do we as a society do about such things as racism, AIDS, education, mental health, children, women, families, persons with disabilities, the elderly. These are social policy issues. And needless to say, my expertise in this, which I took not only from my undergraduate studies, but through my doctoral work, and eventually through three postdoctoral programs. The last one was at Harvard. I'm a Harvard fellow. My focus on social policy opened a door that I never thought I'd have opened to me when in 1989, as you all know, communism collapsed in Eastern Europe. Communism, going back 100+ years to the writings of Karl Marx, which I'm going to talk a little bit about because I want you to understand the foundation of communist ideology. I want you to understand why there are still communist countries. I want you to understand the appeal that communism had to the average person. Because in philosophy, not in practice, but in philosophy, it's a very beautiful philosophy. Very beautiful, but I guess we can call it pretty naive. Naive if what you really think is that you and I, that people in general, that human nature really allows us to place the interests of other people above our own interests. Which you know in a capitalist society, it's all about self-interest. It's all about greed. I'm not besmirching capitalism. Understand that. Capitalism is based on the motivation of people to get what they can for themselves and their families. Communism is based on the philosophy, on the assumption that people really have the capacity to see beyond their own noses, to really place the interests of the community, communism, above their own interests. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. Keep in mind, 1989 rolls around. I'm the dean of a very large university in Michigan, and all of a sudden, all the writing and the speaking I had done on communism from my earliest days as a professor, and by the way, you should know, this is my 37th year in higher education. You don't become the dean or vice president of a college. You don't get into a position such as I'm in without having walked in the shoes of the professors that teach you. I was a professor at many different colleges and universities, and at one was chosen the Distinguished University Professor for my teaching and my research. I say this to you not boastfully, please understand that. I say this to you by way of introduction so that you understand the credibility behind what I'm about to teach you. Okay? All right. I'm the Dean of Arts and Sciences at a big Michigan university. And suddenly, 1989, I get a call from the government of Romania. If you've done your reading, then you know when communism collapsed symbolically with the fall of the Berlin Wall in November, we're celebrating it this year, November 1989. The Berlin Wall collapses, symbolizing the collapse of communism throughout Eastern Europe. And the first place it takes place, and in the most violent overthrow, the dictator, the brutal, brutal dictator of Romania. I was there for almost 7 years advising the president of Romania. The brutality of this regime is beyond your comprehension. And if I get a chance later on, I'll tell you more. I don't want to jump all over. I do want us to go back and understand the underlying ideology, philosophy of communism. But here I get called. Can you imagine? Well, maybe not so young professor, but all of a sudden I get called, and suddenly they want to know what I can do to help them make a historic transition and transformation. Historic. From a totalitarian society to a democratic society. From a communist command economic system, centralized, collectivized economic system, to a capitalist system. This is so foreign to them. And then fundamentally, to deal with the very questions I mentioned to you before. What do we do about persons with disabilities? What do we do when people are out of work? These countries, the thought of paying somebody while they're not working was foreign to them. A person with a disability in a communist country, do you know in Albania, where I worked for many years, you could be living next door to a family that had a disabled child that you never saw in 20 years because they weren't allowed out of the house. Because it was labeled a shame. And lest you are really shocked about that, the fact of the matter is, most of you weren't around in the early 1960s when you would never see persons with disabilities in an ad. You can open the Sunday supplement today and you can look at the advertisements for Target and all, and guess what? You're going to see persons with disabilities there. We've come a long way in this society, but in any event, all these same questions and challenges were posed to me, and what I could do to help those governments move in that direction and embrace fundamental change. And I have to tell you, fundamental change is a change in your way of thinking. You can't change what you do without first changing the way you think about what you do or what you should do. Is that, you accept that? You have to change the way you perceive the rights of children or the rights of women or the rights of persons with disabilities or the rights of minorities. Minorities. And before I forget, let me tell you that by spring of next semester, I will be back in Albania because the man that is now prime minister is the man I got elected. I managed his campaign, and the invitation now to Dr. Berkowitz is to come back and help that country deal with gypsies. Gypsies today occupy the social cellar of all of Europe. You would be appalled at the way gypsies are treated. They're not permitted to have jobs. They're not permitted to enroll their children in education, in schools. You can see them in the cities. I mean, you can go to Romania today, and in the capital city of Bucharest, you can see these beautiful little girls walking around with flowers, selling flowers. Well, guess what the name of the largest gypsy tribe is in Romania? The florists. That's the industry they have. But you should also know that at the end of the day, these children have to go back to their homes where they're allowed to live. And you know where they're allowed to live? Only around landfills. They're not permitted to live within the city. And while they're living around landfills, you should know that because they're denied the right to work, their parents push these children to the front of the line when these enormous garbage trucks come in so that their children could have the first right, the first opportunity to sift through the refuse of the rest of the population. And in so doing, it's not uncommon in a given month for 10 children to be crushed under the wheels of these garbage trucks. Can you imagine living like that? Okay. Now I'm going to reel it back, and we're going to go back to communism. Where did it come from? How did it originate? What is it? What does it stand for? How is it different from what we know and how we live? Well, you've got to go back to its founder, its father, Karl Marx. By the way, I bear a striking resemblance to Karl Marx, if you've not seen a picture of him. When I was in China, I spent 5 months in China. I was the vice president of a very prestigious university in California, and China at the time was very interested in forming partnerships with American universities. So I spent 5 months in China, and here I am in Beijing, in the Forbidden City, and people were walking by and looking at me, and of course one little group stopped and they said, "Excuse me, but you look just like Karl Marx." And I said, no. Karl Marx looks like me. Karl Marx, born in 1818, died in 1888. Karl Marx was born Jewish, not that that's relevant at all, but to some extent it is, because Karl Marx, the founder, the father of communism, you must know that in his constructions of the ideal society, a communist society, imagine there's no religion. Is that a song or something? Yeah, communist societies are godless societies. They are atheist society. The practice of religion is strictly prohibited. Karl Marx writes in 1848 what, to me, today, many scholars will agree is one of the greatest social and political treatises ever written. If you get nothing else out of this lecture, if I can't encourage you to do anything else, really take the time to read the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx. The Communist Manifesto. 100 pages. You can read it in a couple of hours. And I want to tell you, it's so literate. And the philosophy that is describing communism is so beautiful and alluring that you can't imagine that something so brilliantly written was written for the common person. This was not written for scholars. This was written for factory workers, for stevedores working on the dock, for peasants. Written for them. And he sets forth the principles of communism. And so what are they? Let me just, oversimplify here. In communism, imagine a society in which there are no social classes. No social or economic differences between us. In a communist society, there's no private ownership of property. You don't own your house. You don't even own the right to make a decision. Like, should I go to school? Where should I go to school? What should I study? The society, the government, through its organ of government, determines that for you. In a communist society, there's no religion, there's no God. As a matter of fact, you remember the old saying that religion is what? What did he say? Is the opiate of the masses. Communism, everything is under state control. Everything is under state control. You don't even own your children. Your children are considered a public commodity. To some extent, that isn't a bad thing when we think of how a community, I mean, isn't that where the old saying comes, a village, right? Well, when you think about the fact that the responsibility for a healthy upbringing of a child doesn't belong just to the parents. So go back to, how many of you have read Plato? Plato, the philosopher, Plato's Republic, 2,000 years ago. Plato's ideal republic was essentially the same. Children didn't belong. In Plato's ideal republic, when a child was born to a family, they were taken away. Kind of, not exactly, but kind of like in Israel, where they have the system of kibbutzes, where children are raised kind of collectively, but of course parents still, the children belong to them. But in Plato's Republic, the child was taken away. You don't even know which child was yours. The assumption being that when faced with a large group of, if all of you were children, and this was Plato's Republic, any one of you could be my child. And as a result, I have to treat all of you as if you were my child. Communism was like that as well. No political parties. You know, we have all kinds of political parties. Freedom of expression. Well, you know what? You can't criticize the government in a communist society. I know people during the communist era that spent as much as 15 years in solitary confinement for nothing more than writing something critical of the communist regime. 15 years. How many of you could last 15 days in solitary confinement? Okay. Well, all right, let's move forward. Karl Marx writes about the Communist Manifesto, and he really writes a challenge to capitalism, because Karl Marx says that communism will evolve when the workers of the world, when you and I, the proletarians, not the owners of the means of production, not the wealthy, but you and I, the laborers, the blue-collar people, finally organize and overthrow the capitalists. Why? What's wrong with capitalism, according to Karl Marx, is as hard as we work, whatever it is we're doing to line the pockets of the owners. Yes? Isn't it true? In private business, the fact is you are owned by them. What you do, you get paid a wage, but understand what you do in the way of production, add it to what everyone else does. After all the costs of raw material, and after especially the labor costs, all that surplus profit where does it go? It goes to my pocket. Karl Marx had a word for this. He called it alienation. In other words, we labor our entire lives to line the pockets of capitalists while we struggle to pay for food and health care and housing and all this. That's what he said was fundamentally wrong with capitalism, is it was predicated on the alienation of the worker. In a communist society, think about this, and maybe you should record this. This is the principle of distribution in a communist society. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. This is where I'm coming back to this question for you is, do we really believe that? Do you really believe that however different we may be in our levels of knowledge and productivity, that whatever we do, the results of our labor should be equally distributed? Yes, no, yep. Some of you might say, sure, you know what, that's what, when living on a communism, living on a commune, everybody contributes and the tide, as it rises, raises all the ships. The more we produce as a group, the better off we all are. Where in a capitalist society, the more we produce, the more we line the pockets of capitalists. The more we become alienated from the very fruits of our labor. So Marx predicted that there would be a final assault on capitalism, that finally the workers of the world would be cognizant of their class, their commonalities as a social class, and they would rise to overthrow capitalism, and what would emerge is the utopian society, communist society. Well, Karl Marx dies in 1888, and of course, let's fast forward to World War I. Karl Marx never lived to see that in World War I, who fights the wars, by the way? The wealthy? Who is in the trenches fighting the wars? The Rockefellers? The poor, right? Excuse me, what? Yeah. It's the proletarians. It's the common people that have no issue with the man they're about to kill, right? But along comes World War I, and what are we seeing? We're seeing the working class people of different nations killing each other, and who's profiting? Even on the losing side, who's profiting? The owners of the factories, the armaments makers, the whatever you can do to profit on the deaths of common people. Do you see how this is starting to, suddenly they realize that, okay, he's talking about communism and this overthrow, but what we're actually seeing in World War I is just the opposite. We're seeing the working class. If we could only unite them, if we could only get them to rise above their nationalistic boundaries and recognize that there is a common cause for the working person. Well, a great German researcher does a study, an interesting study. His name is Roberto Michels. You don't need to know this, but let me give you, have you ever heard of what's called the iron law of oligarchy? Have you ever heard of the iron law of oligarchy? All right, what is an oligarchy? An oligarchy, quite simply, is The tendency, oligarchical tendency, is the tendency for any human organization, the tendency for power and control to become concentrated in the hands of a few people in that organization. Does that pretty much describe the world we live in? In almost any human organization, the power and control gets concentrated in the hands of the few who come to dominate the many. There is an elite, a governing elite, and then there are the masses. Well, here's a guy that decides he's going to study whether, if this is true generally, if it's an iron law and any organization is subject to these tendencies, what if we study the Socialist Labor Party? What if we study the people that are actually in organizations that are predicated on their very opposition to oligarchy? Labor unions, right? I mean, isn't a labor union supposed to represent the interests of the working class? Well, guess what they found out? In labor unions, in socialist political parties, the power comes to be concentrated in the hands of a few at the expense of the many. And don't you think that that was exactly the way communism unfolded throughout the world? Do you really think that the children of communist leaders had the same opportunities, or the children of the proletariat had the same opportunities as the children of the communist leaders? Do you think they lived the same quality of life, had the same standard of living? This is where the notion, I'm sure you've heard it, remember it. Absolute power corrupts, power corrupts absolutely. Absolute power corrupts, power corrupts absolutely. The people that got involved in the communist movement to establish these organizations and gain control eventually reached a position within those organizations where they reserved unto themselves the very privileges and rights that were denied everybody else. All right, Karl Marx dies, but along comes a guy born in 1870, died in 1924, a guy named Vladimir, not Putin, but Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin, a brilliant young man. Guy was #1 in his class as a student, as a very young man. #1 in his class. This was a guy that grew up watching not only his family, but the families of many Russian people starve. I'm talking about dying from starvation. Is there a more awful death? Is there a more awful death than starving? In the concentration camps, members of my family, before they were put in crematoria, died of starvation. Vladimir Lenin grows up seeing this. As a matter of fact, his brother, Lenin's older brother, only a couple years older, is in college and becomes active in a movement to overthrow the Tsar because of the policies leading to the suffering of the Russian people. His brother is busted in a campaign where trying to organize this, and guess what? His brother is executed. Executed, not by a communist government, but by the Tsar. His brother. Lenin himself then is guilty by association and finally is kicked out of college because of his ties to radical ideology. But Lenin goes and lives in exile and starts doing his own writing about, he takes Karl Marx's ideas and he puts his own imprimatur on it. So what you hear was once Marxism, today now is Marxist-Leninism. It's now a kind of an integration of the ideas of Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. And it's Marx that believed that the governing of the society should really be governed by us, the common people. But it's Vladimir Lenin that comes along and says, well, yes and no. Between you and me, the masses are asses. And what we really need are a few highly educated people, a ruling elite. So Marxist-Leninism kind of changes the idea of communism being something that is egalitarian. Everybody is on the same level too. Well, but we'll tolerate a ruling elite. 1917 comes, Tsar Nicholas is in power. There are food shortages. Agriculture is suffering. People are starving. And suddenly, and Lenin is doing this writing from another country, and there is a revolution, 1917. Do you know what it is? The Bolshevik Revolution, 1917. The Bolsheviks, the precursors to the communists, the Communist Party. Lenin orchestrates the overthrow of the Tsar in 1917, and a couple of years later, just to put a period at the end of this sentence and the end of this chapter, he has the Tsar and the Tsar's children and family assassinated, murdered. But now Lenin takes control, and people loved Vladimir Lenin. They loved this guy. They adored this guy, but he was sickly. He had, imagine in your late 40s, he had stroke after stroke. And finally, at the age of 54, Vladimir Lenin dies. And you should see the documentaries of how the people of Russia reacted to the death of Vladimir Lenin. They, what we saw here when John F. Kennedy or Dr. Martin Luther King were killed, nothing compared to what they did for Vladimir Lenin. But all right, Lenin dies in 1924, but the head of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, by the way, the Bolsheviks, it was Vladimir Lenin that actually created the label communist, the Communist Party. He creates the Communist Party, and who succeeds him by many people's standards is the most brutal dictator in history. And I know you're thinking, well, wait a minute, Adolf Hitler was German, not Russian. Joseph Stalin. Joseph Stalin was responsible for, they say Adolf Hitler was no doubt responsible for the deaths of 6 million Jews because of his policy of genocide. He wanted to eliminate Jews everywhere as a race, which they're not. They're not a race. 6 million Jews, and of course, maybe another 10 million people. World War II. Do you know how many people died in all of World War II? Does anybody have a clue? 50 million people. 50 million people around the world died in World War II. Do you know how many people in Russia died from the policies, the brutal policies of Joseph Stalin? They estimate somewhere between 22 to 60 million. 22 to 60 million people starved, executed by Joseph Stalin. He puts his own brand on communism, Stalinism. And I want to tell you, there was nothing, the world hasn't seen anything like this Stalinist regimes were the most brutal regimes. Enemies lists, everyone that was in the Politburo, everyone that was in the government when Vladimir Lenin was elected the leader of the Communist Party in 1920. Everyone, 5,000 of those who were in the Politburo were killed. Everyone, not one lived. Joseph Stalin eliminated his competition. The most loyal generals also suffered that fate because he trusted no one. So Stalin now comes to power, but understand that now comes 1933. Adolf Hitler becomes the chancellor in Germany, and now Germany is on the move. Keep in mind, having lost World War I, Germany went through a depression in every respect throughout the 1920s. Come the 1930s, Germany was ripe for a leader that would give them a vision of an Aryan, pure race society that would rule the world. And that was the goal of fascism. Adolf Hitler emerges, Chancellor, 1933. By 1939, ladies and gentlemen, Adolf Hitler was already having people annihilated. You must know that it was public policy. The average person, the average German resident knew that a person with a disability, a physical or a mental disability, was euthanized. Can you imagine living in a society where somebody with missing an arm, or somebody that was autistic or developmentally know that they were taken to a place and euthanized? That was public policy. It was not kept a secret. Hitler then invades Czechoslovakia, he invades Hungary. He even after signing an agreement with Joseph Stalin, before World War II, Joseph Stalin and Hitler actually liked each other. They actually had an agreement to divide up the world. Nobody knew this at the time. But what happened? Adolf Hitler turned around and invaded Russia. Stalin got a little upset about it and became an ally. The unlikely ally of the Western powers, of France, of Great Britain, the United States, Canada. World War II gets fought. Not going to go into the details there, but now comes the end of the war. Germany is defeated. The Japanese are defeated in the Pacific Theater. And guess what the powers did? Not Italy, but Russia, the United States, the four of them. Russia, the United States, Great Britain, and France. They actually sat down. I want you to understand this. They sat down like this, and they decided who was going to get what. Who's going to get China? And who's going to get the Balkan Peninsula, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Hungary? And who's going to get the Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia? Do you understand that the four powers, the allies who won World War II, decided to divide up the world? Do you understand that? To divide up the world. Starting with Germany. And keep in mind, Germany was a superpower. Germany was always the anchor in European economics. So Russia had a great Russia wanted all of Germany, but the West, the three others, Great Britain, United States, and France, said nothing doing. So they divided up Germany, and they gave East Germany to Russia, and they divided West Germany, the democratic side, among the three others. That's when the Berlin blockade began. That's where the symbolic Iron Curtain fell. You know the term Iron Curtain, right? Symbolizing what? The lack of any ability to cross boundaries here. The Iron Curtain has fallen, dividing east from west. By the way, when we talk about the powers of the world being divided, do we talk about the North and the South? No. We did in the Civil War, but you know what? When we talk about the world being divided, it's never North and South. It's always the East and the West. So, Stalin now has taken control of these countries now that have been ceded over to the communist world. This is what comes to be called the Eastern Bloc. You've read this in your book, the Eastern Bloc, right? The Eastern Bloc is all of the countries I worked in. Albania, Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia. That's the Balkan Peninsula, surrounded by the Black Sea on the eastern side and the Adriatic Sea between Italy and the peninsula there. Well, all right. Now you've got the Berlin Wall, which, by the way, started not as a wall; it started as barbed wire. But from 1945 until 1959, 2 million people said, you know what, we're not staying on this side, the communist side, because the quality of life, the standard of living was so bad. And remember, there was nothing to keep them from moving. So 2 million people made this move from East Germany, East Berlin, to West Berlin, West Germany, because they had the freedom to do that until Joseph Stalin said, what's wrong with this picture? What we really need to do is we need to keep them here, keep them from moving. So, of course, this is where the barbed wire starts, and then by 1961, in a matter of 4 days, they built the Berlin Wall, 12 feet high, 4 feet wide. And the Berlin Wall, how is it justified to the people who are living on the communist side? You know what they were told? The people on the communist side of East Germany were told, you must know that on the Western side, there's still fascists. There's still Nazis. They're dangerous. Many people believed that. Others didn't, and others still tried to escape, and by the way, paid 5,000 of them, paid with their lives. The Berlin Wall was not intended to keep the enemy from coming in. It was intended to keep the people from going out. Berlin Wall was built in 1961, and we know the rest of it. 1989, November 1989, after various iterations in Russia, and I guess I shouldn't skip, there's a large block there from 61 to 89, but eventually the first and major symbol of communism collapses, the Berlin Wall. I'm going to move very quickly and then give you an opportunity to ask me some questions. All right, 1961, remember now, the war ends 1945, the year that Franklin Roosevelt dies in his third term as president, an unprecedented, no other person in American history served, or excuse me, four terms as president. But anyway, he dies. Harry Truman comes in, and of course, Harry Truman presides over the development of the atomic bomb. He orders it dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It ends World War II in the Pacific Theater, but now he's immediately confronted with the challenges of a communist threat. He creates what's called the Truman Doctrine. Have you read about the Truman Doctrine? The Truman Doctrine is basically the right of the West to stop the spread of communism. It was really a policy of containing communism, which meant that wherever there was a civil war that appeared to be financed, organized, precipitated by the communist world, the United States and the West had a right to intervene. The Truman Doctrine, to contain it. So you must know that the Cold War was never fought in a declared war between the United States or the Western powers and the Soviet Union. You know that. But you must know that there hasn't been a war since the end of World War II that was not a proxy war between the two superpowers fought in a local theater. Starting with the Chinese Civil War. 1945. Remember, what's the second largest communist country in the world? And does it still exist? Did you ever ask yourself the question, well, if communism collapsed everywhere else, why is it still in China? Have you wondered about what you're seeing on TV when Hong Kong is trying to maintain its independence and it's being crushed by the Chinese? We'll talk about that on another day. The Chinese Civil War is a war between Chiang Kai-shek, who leads the nationalists in China, and a little-known guy named Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, who represents the communist world. The battle gets fought, and understand that the West, America and the Western powers, are supporting Chiang Kai-shek. Russia is backing Mao Zedong. The war eventually, the Civil War ends. Chiang Kai-shek leaves mainland China, and where does he go? He goes to the Republic of Taiwan. You know where that, you know your geography here? The island of Taiwan today still is not part of mainland China, and it calls itself the Republic of China in Taiwan. They're independent. They're not under communist rule. But communist China now, Red China, comes under the rule of Mao Zedong, 1949. So now Mao, and by the way, Mao and Stalin were very dear friends. So there was this connection now between two great powers, Russia and China. But then there's the West. And every one of these wars, all of a sudden, Russia decides that it's going to support the war in Korea by having North Korea invade South Korea. By the way, are those tensions still going on today? Of course. North Korea now invades South Korea, and it's real clear that it's Russia behind the North Korean communists. So who backs South Korea? The West. Ladies and gentlemen, these are just some of the proxy wars between the West and the communist world. Korea, Vietnam. North Vietnam was supported by who? By Russia. They were the North Vietnamese communists. South Vietnam, that war fought first by the French, then the United States. Now comes Cuba. All of a sudden, 1959, there's an overthrow of the corrupt Batista regime in Cuba. Supported by Batista, was corrupt but supported by the United States. Batista is overthrown by whom? By Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro is a fervent communist. He loves Nikita Khrushchev. By the way, Joseph Stalin dies in 1953. And emerging after Stalin is Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev then sees an opportunity. You know, the Americans had put missile bases in Turkey, in Iran. You remember when Iran was under the Shah of Iran, we put missiles there. All of a sudden, Russia is surrounded by nuclear missiles, missile sites. Suddenly now there's a communist country 50 miles from America. Khrushchev decides at the request of Fidel Castro after the failure of the Bay of Pigs, we tried to overthrow Cuba. So I don't want to get into too much of that, but we actually trained some people to go in and overthrow Fidel Castro. Well, word got leaked about that plan, and it was a miserable disaster. We failed to overthrow Cuba. Cuba now reaches out to Russia and says, you know what, we're being threatened by the United States. Russia then puts missiles on ships and starts sending them to Cuba until we, in 1961, discover through our spy planes that there are missile bases being built in Cuba. 13 Days, a very famous book, John F. Kennedy. Now, the world has not come this close to a nuclear war ever. Ever. And it was a battle of wills. And Nikita Khrushchev thought that John Kennedy, after the failure of the Bay of Pigs, thought John Kennedy was a weak leader. And guess what? Kennedy was told by his military advisors, let's go in full force, let's bomb the hell out of Cuba, and let's end this. But Kennedy said no. He knew there was always the threat of a nuclear engagement with Russia. What he did is he sets up a blockade, and Russia backs down. They pull their missiles out of Cuba, which, by the way, spelled the end for Nikita Khrushchev. When he backed down, when a young John F. Kennedy caused him to back down, Khrushchev quietly retires. By the way, I've been to his gravesite. It's got no name on it. It's got no name on it. It would be if you were walking in a neighborhood on a tree lawn next to a street, Nikita Khrushchev. So, all right, well, after Khrushchev, the tensions continue and the proxy wars continue. There is the 6-Day War in Israel. There's the Middle East conflict after that. This spreads to Afghanistan. You got to know that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan well before the United States got involved. Throughout the 1980s, the Soviet-Afghan War was actually called the Soviets' Vietnam. It was Russia's Vietnam. They were defeated by the Afghans with the help of the United States. So you got to understand that the very people that we're fighting against now were the people that we armed years ago to fight Russia. All right. Fast forward, now we're in the 1980s. Now comes a President Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan is asked the question, what's your policy toward the communist world? And his answer is very simple. We win, they lose. That's what his answer was. We win, they lose. You got to understand that during this period, Russia was putting all this money into arms. Understand that the Cold War was not just a war between soldiers. It was not only an arms race, it was a space race, right? It was a competition. Who had the technology? And of course, 1959, Sputnik, the first satellite, gets launched by the Soviet Union. 1961, the first astronaut goes into space, Russian astronaut, Yuri Gagarin. But in 1969, we put the first man on the moon. Guess we won that race, huh? All right. The 1980s comes, Russia is crumbling because it simply can't afford to put all this money into its arms, into weapon systems that aren't going to be used. Mr. Reagan, on the other hand, spends $1.6 trillion, and he unveils a plan, what he's calling Star Wars. Star Wars. an ability of the United States to create, you know how Israel has what's called the Iron Dome? You know how in the Gaza war recently, as the missiles came into Israel, hundreds of them, they were blown out of the sky? This was Ronald Reagan's thought about Star Wars. Any nuclear missile launch could be knocked out of the sky before it reached its destination. Finally, Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union and realizes he's got to fix his economy. He's got to stop putting all this money they don't have into the arms race. But then he starts restructuring the economy. He starts being more open to criticism. And don't you know, as a result of that, all of the communist states that they had started questioning whether or not they should continue to be in the Soviet Union. 1989, we're back to where we started. Communism collapses. Well, I think I'm going to stop there, but let me just end with a couple of thoughts on, now I'm invited into Romania, into Albania. So, one of the first things I did for the capital city of Albania, I want you to understand that Albania was special to me for another reason. When I went to Romania over a 6 to 7 year period, I had to have soldiers and bodyguards because I was a Jew. If I didn't have them, well, I was always at great risk going there, but there was a barrier there. They were there. When I stayed at night, where I stayed at night, they had soldiers outside of my door. That's the way it had to be. Albania, well, let's put it this way. In Romania, there were 1 million Jewish people before World War II. After World War II, there was 1,800. Albania had more Jews after the war than before the war. And it was because as the Jews were escaping those Hungary and Poland and all that, when they got to Albania, guess what? The peasants hid them, dressed them as peasants, and hid them in their barns and saved Jewish people at great personal risk to their own lives. Anyway, I start in Albania, and I did a 20-year master plan. That's why you're looking at this, it says 2020. I did a 20-year master plan to have the capital city of Albania join. You see what these? Vienna, Florence, Italy, and Athens, Greece. My goal was to have the capital city of Albania take its proper place along other European capitals. And that's what this article is all about. Every time I went to Albania, when I got back to the United States, there was always a story. This is front page story in a California newspaper on my work in Europe. Understand that during the communist era, people had things like nothing to eat and no sources of heat. So you know what they did? They cut down all the trees. You go to Albania, when I started going to Albania, you couldn't see a tree anywhere because people illegally cut them down for firewood. When I got back to California, I organized a meeting of a group called CAN, the California Association of Nurserymen. And guess what? They donated 10,000 trees and paid for it to be shipped to Albania and put in the capital city. So this was part of that article. See this guy right here? This is the guy I got elected as mayor of the capital city. His name is Eddie Rama. If you go on the internet today and look up Eddie Rama, guess what? He is the Prime Minister of Albania. Something I predicted when I started working with this guy because he was dripping with charisma and integrity. So you can imagine when I started going there, what does that second word say? Can you imagine when I started going to Albania, and every magazine, every newspaper, they referred to me as the Hebrew? I was mortified. I also had my bodyguards and my soldiers, but I'll tell you more about this later. Every time, by the way, Gazeta, this is the Albanian Gazette. So here's an interesting article on another trip. If you're having a hard time seeing his face, that was how they wanted this paper, this article to appear, because the entire newspaper, this entire page is Berkowitz, or that they have the Serbian spelling. What's the second word up there? So why did they fade this? Because the article was about who is that guy? Who's that guy behind the guy? So this was very interesting. And by the way, this is all in Albanian. I have a translation if you're really interested in it. But now comes a funny story. Every time I go to Albania, I'm in Time magazine. Time magazine publishes in their individual countries. So when I got Eddie Rama elected as mayor, by the time I left, they wrote an article and said, "Shalom, Dr. Berkowitz." That was back in the day when I wore my... But funnier still is that when I came home, I told my president of my college, I said, "You know what? I've been told I'm going to be on the cover of Time magazine." And she said, "Well, if you're on the cover of Time magazine, I want to see it." So I walked into her office. And there I am. Of course, I walked in, and I covered that, and she looked at it and she said, "But where's your beard?" There I am on the cover of Time magazine, and what does it say? The Hebrew. Ladies and gentlemen, what I found out was that they really liked Jewish people, and they were happy. They wanted people to know that a Jewish guy was advising the government. Anyway, we're almost out of time. I wanted to give you a little bit of an opportunity to ask me any questions. I see some of you leaving. Any questions at all? Did you get anything out of this today? Was it?